The phone rang when the coffee had already gone cold. It was past midnight. The station smelled of old paper, cigarette smoke, and something metallic that never quite left the walls. A single fluorescent light flickered above the desk, buzzing like an insect that refused to die. Someone had left a file open. Someone always did. The ringing cut through the room again. Sharp. Impatient. He picked up on the third ring. The voice on the other end was calm. Almost polite. "I think I need to turn myself in," the man said. No screaming. No panic. Just a voice with weight behind it. Low. Measured. The kind of voice that sounded like it belonged to someone who waited his turn in line and held doors open for strangers. The officer leaned back in his chair, pen hovering above the paper. He had heard this before. Drunks. Liars. Men trying to scare their wives. Men who wanted attention more than forgiveness. "What for?" he asked. There was a pause. Not hesitation. Calculation. For a series of murders. The word sat there, heavy, refusing to move. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing on wet asphalt. Somewhere down the hall, water dripped steadily into a stained sink. The officer glanced at the clock, then back at the phone, suddenly aware of the cold plastic against his ear. "You want to start again," he said. Slower this time. The man chuckled softly. A strange sound to hear at that hour. Not amused. Not nervous. Just aware. "I killed my mother," the voice said. "And several other people before her." The officer's pen touched the paper, leaving a small ink blot. He didn't write anything yet. People confessed to killing their parents all the time. Words were cheap. Blood was expensive. Proof even more so. "Where are you calling from?" he asked. "My apartment," the man replied. "In Santa Cruz." That got his attention. Santa Cruz had been bleeding quietly for months. Girls hitchhiking. Girls disappearing. Bodies found weeks later, when the ocean decided to give them back. Newspapers called it bad luck. Police reports called it unrelated. The voice continued, uninvited, unhurried. "I've been waiting for the right moment. I think this is it." The officer felt sweat gather under his collar despite the cold room. He loosened his tie and tried to keep his tone flat. "Sir," he said, "if this is a joke." "It's not," the man interrupted gently. "I can give you details." And he did. Addresses. Dates, all spoken out, careful, precise. Descriptions that matched things never released to the press. The officer stopped leaning back. His chair creaked as he moved forward. His knuckles whitened around the pen. "How do you know this?" he asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "Because I was there," the voice said. "Every time." Silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. The officer could hear breathing on the other end. Slow. Controlled. Like a man sitting comfortably in his own skin. "Why call now?" the officer asked. The answer came immediately. "Because I'm tired," the man said. "And because no one was ever going to stop me." There was no pride in it. No self-pity either. Just an observation, like commenting on the weather. The officer swallowed. "What's your name?" he asked. "Edmund," the man said. "Most people call me Ed." A normal name. A friendly name. Outside, a siren wailed briefly, then faded. The world kept moving. It always did. The officer wrote it down. Edmund. "Stay where you are," he said. "Officers are on their way." "I'll be here," Edmund replied. "I've put the gun down." Another small pause. "And officer," he added. "Yes. You might want to bring more than one pair of handcuffs." The line went dead. The officer stared at the phone for a long moment before placing it back on the receiver. His hands were shaking now. He noticed it the way one notices a strange detail in a familiar room. Across town, a man sat alone in a quiet apartment, surrounded by the evidence of his own patience. And no one yet understood that the most frightening thing about him was not what he had done. It was how easy he was to listen to. By the time the patrol cars reached the apartment, the idea of a monster had already begun to fall apart. Monsters were supposed to snarl, to sweat, to run. They were supposed to look like guilt even before they spoke. This man opened the door calmly, hands visible, posture relaxed. He was tall, too tall, filling the doorway like a piece of furniture that didn't quite fit the room it was placed in. He wore a simple shirt. Clean. Buttoned. No blood. No panic. No drama. "Gentlemen," he said, stepping aside. "You're right on time." One of the officers hesitated. Not because of fear, because of confusion. The voice matched the call. Warm. Steady. The kind of voice that could sell you a used car and make you thank him afterward. Edmund Kemper did not resist. He turned around when asked. He placed his hands behind his back carefully, as if afraid of inconveniencing someone. When the cuffs clicked shut, he sighed, not in relief, but in something close to completion. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. No overturned furniture. No signs of struggle. Just the smell of old books, cheap aftershave, and something faintly sweet beneath it all. In the kitchen, officers found what they had already begun to fear. Proof that could not be argued with. Proof that did not scream but whispered relentlessly. One officer muttered a curse under his breath. Another asked, "Why call us?" Kemper tilted his head slightly, considering the question as if it were philosophical rather than practical. "Because," he said, "I was done." That answer followed them all the way to the station. At the precinct, the questions came fast at first. Names. Dates. Places. Then slower. More cautious. As if everyone in the room was afraid that pushing too hard might break something fragile and unpredictable. But Kemper didn't break. He talked. He talked the way professors talked, explaining concepts step by step. He corrected officers gently when they misremembered timelines. He joked, quietly, dryly, about his own size, about how hard it was to blend in when you stood head and shoulders above everyone else. "I suppose I was memorable," he said once, smiling faintly. No one laughed. The reports described him as cooperative. Respectful. Almost eager. The word charming appeared more than once, crossed out and replaced with something safer. And somewhere between the second cup of coffee and the third cigarette, the unspoken question settled into the room like smoke. Do monsters sound like this? Because this man did not speak like a beast. He spoke like someone who had thought about things. Someone who understood consequences, and simply stepped past them. "You feel bad about it?" an officer asked eventually. Kemper looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were alert. Curious. Studying. "I feel bad that it took so long," he said. For anyone to notice. That was the moment the room shifted. Not because of what he said, but because of what it implied. Santa Cruz had been afraid for months. Girls had vanished. Parents had waited by phones that never rang. Flyers had peeled off street poles in the sun. And the men responsible had been sitting in bars with cops, listening to them speculate about him as if he were an abstract idea. Evil, it turned out, didn't always hide. Sometimes it leaned in and listened. Kemper stretched his cuffed hands slightly, as if they were stiff. "You see," he continued, conversationally, "people imagine killers as impulsive. Sloppy. But that's just comforting fiction." He smiled again. Smaller this time. Order is much more efficient. Someone slammed a file shut. Someone else looked away. And in that moment, the story everyone thought they understood collapsed into something far more uncomfortable. Because if this man was a monster, then he was also patient. Intelligent. Polite. Which raised a far worse question. If evil could sound reasonable, how often had it already been speaking? And while they sat there, trying to reconcile the voice with the facts, Edmund Kemper leaned back in his chair, perfectly still. As if waiting for the story to finally catch up to him. Edmund Kemper did not grow into his body. He was trapped inside it. By the time other children learned how to disappear into groups, he was already towering over teachers, over doorframes, over expectations. His hands were too large. His voice too deep too early. He moved like someone constantly afraid of breaking things simply by existing. At home, there was no place to put that much boy. The house smelled of stale smoke and resentment. His mother's perfume mixed poorly with alcohol, sharp enough to sting the nose. Doors slammed not in anger, but in punctuation. Every sentence ended the same way. She called him names. Not creative ones. Accurate ones, sharpened by repetition. He was told he was ugly. He was told no woman would ever want him. He was told that men like him were dangerous, even when they were trying to be good. So she locked him away. The basement was cold and low-ceilinged, the kind of place where pipes sweat and shadows cling to the corners. The light bulb hummed weakly, as if embarrassed by its own existence. Down there, time moved differently. Night stretched. Thoughts fermented. From above came laughter. Radio music. The sound of life continuing without him. Sometimes his sisters passed by the door. He could hear their footsteps. Their freedom. They were told to be careful around him. As if danger were contagious. Edmund learned something important in that basement. He learned how to listen. He learned how to replay words until they lost their original shape and became something else. Something heavier. Something sharper. When he finally slept, he dreamed of control. Not power, order. Things being where they were supposed to be. At school, he watched teachers carefully. He noted who liked to be flattered and who liked to be feared. He learned that adults were not as solid as they pretended. That authority bent easily when pressed in the right places. Once, he buried a cat in the yard. Later, he dug it up. He didn't do it in a frenzy. There was no rage. Just curiosity. An urge to understand where life stopped and something else began. The smell stayed with him for days. Earth and decay and revelation. When his mother found out, she did not scream. She laughed. She told him this was proof. Proof that there was something wrong with him. Proof that she had been right all along. Edmund absorbed it silently. He was very good at absorbing things. The night he shot his grandparents came quietly. The house was still. The kind of stillness that presses against the ears. He held the rifle awkwardly, its weight unfamiliar but reassuring. His grandmother entered the kitchen, turned, and never finished the sentence she had started. The sound was louder than he expected. The recoil surprised him. The silence afterward felt enormous. His grandfather came home later. He didn't even have time to be afraid. When it was over, Edmund sat down and waited. He did not run. He did not cry. He did not celebrate. He simply waited for adults to arrive and explain what was supposed to happen next. They did. The reports described him as calm. Confused. Cooperative. They used words like troubled and disturbed, but not dangerous. Dangerous was reserved for people who didn't explain themselves so well. In court, his size worked against him and for him at the same time. He looked monstrous standing there, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. But when he spoke, the room softened. He said he had been afraid. He said he didn't understand what he had done. He said the right things. And everyone was relieved to believe him. They sent him away, but not forever. Treatment, they said. Observation. Time. No one asked the more uncomfortable question. What happens when a child raised on humiliation learns patience instead of fear? Years later, when Edmund Kemper sat across from detectives, answering questions with unsettling precision, none of this appeared in the transcripts. But it was all there. In the pauses. In the careful wording. In the way he watched faces for reactions instead of approval. Because long before he learned how to kill, he had mastered something far more useful. He had learned how to survive people. And he had learned how to wait. The rifle was heavier than he expected. Not physically, symbolically. Edmund Kemper remembered that weight long after the echo faded. It wasn't fear that made his hands tremble. It was anticipation, mixed with something colder. The understanding that once the sound happened, there would be no erasing it. Only explanations. The farmhouse was quiet that night. Too quiet for a place that held history in its walls. His grandparents trusted him. That was the first mistake, though no one would ever say it out loud. Trust always looks foolish in hindsight. His grandmother stood with her back to him. The moment stretched, fragile and ordinary. She began to turn, perhaps to ask a question, perhaps to complain about something small and irrelevant. The shot cut her off mid-word. The noise filled the room, violent and final. She fell without ceremony. No dramatic pause. No warning music. Just gravity doing its work. Edmund stood there, stunned not by what he had done, but by how quickly it was over. When his grandfather returned later, the pattern repeated. Another shot. Another ending. Less hesitation this time. The line, once crossed, was easier to cross again. Afterward, Edmund sat in a chair and waited. This detail would be mentioned in reports, noted briefly, then forgotten. The waiting. The absence of panic. The lack of escape. When the police arrived, they found him exactly where he had been when it ended. Calm. Polite. Almost relieved to see them. He told them he had been afraid. That he thought his grandmother might tell his mother something unforgivable. That something inside him had snapped. These were acceptable answers. Comforting answers. They fit the narrative of a confused adolescent better than the truth would have. Psychiatrists examined him. They tested his intelligence. They noted his extraordinary memory, his verbal skills, his capacity for insight. One of them wrote that he understood right from wrong. Another wrote that he did not pose a serious threat. That sentence would age poorly. He was sent away to a state hospital for the criminally insane. The word insane did a lot of work there. It implied chaos. Noise. Unpredictability. Edmund was none of those things. Inside the hospital, he watched and learned. He listened to other patients rage and cry and reveal themselves too quickly. He learned what not to say. He learned that silence made people uncomfortable, and discomfort made them talk. He volunteered in the psychiatric ward. Helped staff. Organized tasks. Became useful. Doctors like useful patients. He learned their routines. Their habits. Their blind spots. He learned how authority grows lazy when it believes it is in control. Once, a doctor asked him if he felt remorse. Edmund considered the question seriously. I feel bad that I scared people, he said. It was a careful answer. Not a lie. Just incomplete. Years passed. The world outside changed. Music changed. Hairstyles changed. Fear took on new shapes. Inside, Edmund grew larger. Calmer. More articulate. And eventually, the conversation shifted. He had been good long enough. He had said the right things often enough. The board decided he was rehabilitated. They released him into a world that had already decided to forget what he had done. The irony was quiet but brutal. The first line had already been crossed years ago, in a farmhouse kitchen. Everything after that was just repetition with better excuses. When Edmund Kemper walked out of the hospital, he carried no visible scars. No restraints. No record that followed him loudly enough to matter. He stepped into the sunlight like a man starting over. But some beginnings are just continuations with better lighting. And somewhere deep inside him, the lesson was clear. The system did not fear him. Which meant, eventually, neither would anyone else. Prison did not break Edmund Kemper. It refined him. The walls were thick, painted in institutional colors meant to drain personality from anyone who stayed too long. The air smelled of disinfectant and resignation. Doors slammed on schedules. Lights turned off whether you were ready or not. For some men, this was hell. For Edmund, it was structure. He woke when told. He ate what was given. He spoke when spoken to. Rules, it turned out, were comforting when you understood how flexible they could be. Other inmates tested boundaries with noise and rage. Edmund watched quietly, filing their failures away like case studies. He noticed how guards softened toward men who caused fewer problems. How doctors lingered longer with patients who asked thoughtful questions. How authority enjoyed being mirrored. So he mirrored it. He volunteered for tasks no one wanted. He listened when staff complained about their marriages, their children, their boredom. He nodded in the right places. He remembered details and brought them up later, just casually enough to feel sincere. People like to feel remembered. One guard called him Big Ed and laughed at his own joke. Edmund smiled politely and accepted the nickname like a gift. Another staff member trusted him with keys he shouldn't have held. Not because of policy, because of comfort. Comfort breeds shortcuts. Psychiatrists came and went. Each new one believed they were the first to truly understand him. Edmund let them believe it. He spoke about insight. About growth. About how his actions had been wrong. All true, in a way. They asked him about violence. He spoke about it academically. Distanced. Like someone describing a storm they once saw from far away. One doctor noted that Edmund showed remarkable empathy. That was not entirely incorrect. He understood emotions very well. He simply didn't share them the way others expected. Time passed differently inside. Days blended together, but patterns emerged. He learned the language of therapy. The rhythm of progress reports. The phrases that opened doors. He also learned something darker. He learned that the system was not built to detect patients. It was built to respond to disruption. The loud were dangerous. The quiet were manageable. Edmund became invisible in plain sight. When interviews came, he sat tall but non-threatening. Hands folded. Voice steady. He admitted fault without indulging in guilt. He spoke of responsibility without inviting fear. Once, when asked what he wanted most out of life, he said, to be useful. The room softened. Behind the walls, jokes circulated among staff about the irony of a murderer being so polite. Edmund heard them. He appreciated the humor. It was funny, in a way. He was studying psychology textbooks written by people who had never met anyone like him. He knew their theories better than some of them did. He understood that labels were comfort blankets, not restraints. Eventually, the question was no longer whether he would leave. It was when. The board reviewed his case. Again. And again. Each time, the language shifted slightly. Words like danger faded, replaced by adjustment and insight. Someone asked if he posed a risk to society. Someone else said he had learned his lesson. They all wanted to believe that violence was a phase. That it burned itself out. That people who waited long enough earned redemption by default. Edmund did not correct them. When the decision came, it was delivered without ceremony. A signature. A stamp. Freedom framed as a reward for good behavior. He packed his few belongings neatly. He thanked the staff. He shook hands. One guard joked, "Don't come back, Big Ed." Edmund smiled. "I'll try not to," he said. It sounded like a promise. As he stepped out into the open air, the sun felt too bright. The noise too chaotic. Freedom was messy. Unstructured. But he had learned something invaluable behind those walls. He had learned how institutions think. He had learned how trust is built from repetition, not truth. He had learned that being seen as harmless is more useful than being feared. And most importantly, he had learned that listening was a form of power. The world had opened its doors again. And Edmund Kemper walked through them, carrying nothing illegal, nothing sharp, nothing that would alarm anyone who glanced his way. What he carried instead was far more dangerous. He carried experience. Freedom did not feel like relief. It felt like exposure. The streets were louder than Edmund remembered. Cars moved too fast. People spoke over one another, words colliding without purpose. The air carried smells that didn't belong together: gasoline, salt, fried food, perfume. Chaos disguised as normal life. He stood out immediately. At 6 feet 9 inches tall, there was no such thing as blending in. Heads turned. Eyes lingered. Children stared without shame. Adults tried not to, Edmund noticed everything. He found work where he could. Menial jobs. Temporary places. Nothing that required scrutiny. He lived simply. Cheap rooms. Sparse furniture. A radio humming softly in the background, filling silence without demanding attention. And then he found something better. A job driving for a state mental health facility. The irony was almost elegant. He transported patients. Men and women considered unstable, dangerous, unpredictable. He drove them to appointments, listened to them talk, nodded when they needed affirmation. The keys were his. The schedule was his. Trust, once again, arrived quietly. No one questioned the giant behind the wheel. He was calm. Reliable. Polite. In the evenings, he sat in bars where off-duty cops drank away the boredom of routine. He bought a round now and then. Listened more than he spoke. Let them complain about paperwork, about politics, about a killer somewhere out there who was making them look bad. They talked about the murders in Santa Cruz. About girls who hitchhiked and never made it home. About bodies found in ravines and along highways. About patterns that refused to become clear. Edmund leaned forward, interested. "What do you think he's like?" he asked once, genuinely curious. They laughed. "Probably some drifter," one said. "Some loser," another added. "Doesn't matter," a third shrugged. "We'll catch him." Edmund nodded, filing away the confidence. The assumptions. The blind spots. At night, he drove alone. The road was a ribbon of dark possibility. Headlights cut tunnels through the black. Radios crackled with music and distant voices. Hitchhikers appeared like punctuation marks, sudden, human, hopeful. Young women. Trusting. Tired. Edmund practiced conversations before they happened. Neutral questions. Gentle humor. Nothing threatening. He knew how to sound safe. He had been practicing since childhood. The first time he picked someone up, his hands did not shake. That surprised him. The girl talked about school. About home. About nothing important. Edmund listened carefully, responding just enough to keep her comfortable. When it ended, when the line was crossed again, it felt disturbingly familiar. Not exciting. Not explosive. Organized. He cleaned up meticulously. Returned to routine. Went back to work the next day. Drove patients. Made small talk. Ate lunch. The world did not react. That was the revelation. Freedom, he realized, was just another controlled environment, if you understood the rules. People saw what they expected to see. A large man was assumed to be clumsy, not careful. Quiet, not calculating. Each time, he refined the process. Adjusted timing. Chose locations more carefully. The crimes did not scream for attention. They waited to be discovered. Between acts, Edmund remained patient. He laughed with police officers who unknowingly discussed his work. He offered suggestions. Speculated with them. Played the game flawlessly. One officer clapped him on the shoulder once and said, "You're a good listener, Ed." Edmund smiled. "I've had a lot of practice," he replied. And it was true. Because while the city searched for a shadow, the man they trusted most was learning something new with every mile of asphalt. He was learning that freedom wasn't the absence of control. It was the ability to choose when to use it. And as long as no one connected the dots, as long as he stayed polite and predictable, the experiment could continue. Uninterrupted. Somewhere, another girl stuck out her thumb. And Edmund Kemper was already on the road. The road was always the same. Gray asphalt. White lines. A horizon that promised movement even when nothing really changed. Edmund drove it so often that he no longer noticed the scenery. What mattered were the interruptions. A raised thumb. A hesitant step toward the shoulder. A glance that lingered just long enough to ask a question. Hitchhiking was common then. It felt harmless. A small gamble taken in daylight, justified by youth and necessity. Girls trusted the rhythm of passing cars, the illusion that danger announced itself loudly. Edmund never rushed. He slowed gradually. Rolled the window down. Smiled without showing too much enthusiasm. His voice stayed low and steady, never pushing, never demanding. Need a ride? Sometimes they hesitated. Sometimes they didn't. He accepted both responses equally. When they climbed in, the car filled with new sounds. Nervous laughter. The rustle of bags. The faint scent of shampoo or cigarettes or sun-warmed skin. Edmund noticed everything. He always did. He asked simple questions. Where they were headed. What they studied. Who they missed. He listened closely, adjusting himself to match their energy. Quiet when they were quiet. Curious when they wanted to talk. Trust formed in inches, not miles. The moments before the truth revealed itself were strangely calm. Conversation drifted. Music played softly on the radio. The car became a temporary world where nothing bad had happened yet. That was the cruelest part. Afterward, Edmund returned to routine with unsettling ease. He washed the car. He folded his clothes. He made himself dinner. He slept. There were no nightmares. Newspapers began to notice patterns. Police did not. The victims blurred together in headlines, reduced to numbers and speculation. Runaways. Bad decisions. Wrong place at the wrong time. Society preferred explanations that absolved itself. Edmund followed the coverage closely. He clipped articles. Listened to radio reports. Not for excitement, for feedback. Each delay in understanding reinforced the same conclusion. They were not looking at the right thing. Between disappearances, he remained visible. Reliable. Boring. He attended work. He joked with co-workers. He drank with cops who spoke confidently about a killer they imagined as small, frantic, desperate. Edmund was none of those things. Once, in a bar, someone mentioned the possibility that the killer might be intelligent. The group laughed. Smart guys don't do this kind of thing, someone said. They have too much to lose. Edmund raised his glass slightly. To losing, he said dryly. They assumed it was a joke. Each episode sharpened something inside him. Not hunger. Not rage. Precision. He refined his timing. His choices. His ability to disappear into normality afterward. And yet, something unexpected crept in. Boredom. The routine became predictable. The city remained blind. The police remained friendly. No one challenged him. Northwest One came close enough to see through the performance. The thrill people imagined simply wasn't there. What remained was control, and control, without resistance, grew hollow. Between drives, Edmund began visiting his mother. The visits were tense, polite, laced with old poison. She criticized his appearance. His habits. His failures. She mocked him for his size, his loneliness, his inability to be normal. You're just like your father, she told him once, sipping her drink. Useless and weak. Edmund smiled and helped clear the table. Something began to shift. The girls on the road were no longer the center of the story. They were becoming preparation. Distractions. A way to manage pressure that built elsewhere. Because beneath the calm surface, beneath the routines and polite conversations, an older wound was reopening. And this one had a name. The killings continued, but the meaning was changing. He didn't know it yet, but the road was no longer where the story would end. It was only where it gathered momentum. And while the city slept, unaware of how close the truth sat beside it every night, Edmund Kemper was slowly turning his attention home. Toward the one voice he had never managed to silence. The bar was dim, the kind of place where time stalled after midnight. Sticky floors. Low laughter. The smell of beer soaked into wood that had given up trying to stay clean. This was where police officers came to loosen their collars and speak more freely than they ever should. Edmund Kemper was a regular. He sat at the edge of the group, never at the center. Listened. Nodded. Paid for a round when someone's mood dipped too low. His size made him memorable, but his behavior made him harmless. That was the balance. They talked about work. About paperwork. About women. About a killer who was starting to irritate them more than scare them. "Guy's sloppy," one officer said, tapping ash into a tray. "No," another corrected. "He's just lucky." "Luck runs out," a third added. Edmund swirled his drink slowly. "What makes you say sloppy?" he asked. They turned to him without suspicion. Why would they have any? "Victims hitchhiking," one said. "Same general area." "He's getting predictable." Edmund smiled faintly. "Predictable patterns are comforting," he said. "They make people think they understand something." The officer laughed. "You should be a cop, Ed." Edmund did not reply. Instead, he asked about timelines. About where bodies were found versus where they disappeared. About response times. Jurisdictions. The cracks between departments where responsibility blurred. They told him everything. Why wouldn't they? He wasn't taking notes. He wasn't interrogating. He was just a big guy with a quiet voice and genuine curiosity. Someone who made them feel smart when they explained things. One officer joked that the killer was probably sitting right next to them. Laughter rippled through the table. Edmund laughed too. Softly. At the right moment. That night, driving home, he replayed the conversation carefully. Not for pleasure, for calibration. He adjusted his assumptions. Corrected minor inefficiencies. The next disappearance fit perfectly into the gaps they had just described. Days later, he returned to the bar. The mood had shifted. Tighter. Less joking. A body had been found sooner than expected. Too close to somewhere familiar. One officer frowned. "This guy's changing." Edmund leaned back. "Or you're seeing him more clearly," he said. Someone nodded. Someone else took a long drink. And still, no one looked at him. The idea that danger might sit comfortably among them was too disruptive. It threatened the entire architecture of their confidence. Better to imagine a shadow than confront a reflection. Meanwhile, Edmund continued to help. He offered theories. Logical ones. He suggested the killer might be someone who understood police procedure. Someone calm enough to wait. They wrote it off as interesting speculation. The irony deepened when Edmund began assisting more directly. Through his job, through casual conversations, through proximity, he absorbed information before it became official. He stayed one step ahead without moving fast at all. He was not hiding. He was participating. At one point, an officer looked at him more closely than usual. "You ever get scared?" the man asked. "Driving alone at night like that?" Edmund considered the question seriously. "Not really," he said. "Most people are exactly who they appear to be." The officer nodded, satisfied. That was the moment Edmund understood something essential. The investigation would never catch him by force. Only by interruption. And interruptions, like suspicion, required imagination. Something the room lacked. As weeks passed, pressure mounted. Patrols increased. Fear thickened in the city like fog. Girls hesitated longer before stepping into cars. Some stopped hitchhiking altogether. Opportunity narrowed. Control began to slip. At home, his mother's voice grew sharper. Her criticisms more pointed. "You're sick," she told him one night. Just like they said. Edmund stood in the doorway, listening, absorbing every word. The cops were getting closer to something, even if they didn't know what. The road was no longer enough. The balance was breaking. And in the back of his mind, a realization took shape. The one person who had always known what he was, or claimed to, was still alive. Still speaking. Still cutting. While the city searched for a stranger, Edmund Kemper understood that the most dangerous witness had been waiting for him at home all along. And soon, the conversation that had been postponed for decades would finally happen. Whether anyone else was ready for it or not. The house had not changed. The same narrow hallway. The same furniture chosen for appearance, not comfort. The same air, heavy with old arguments that never fully dissipated. Edmund stood in the kitchen doorway, shoulders nearly brushing the frame. His mother sat at the table with a drink, the glass sweating onto a ring-stained surface. The radio murmured in the background, a cheerful voice announcing a song about love. She didn't look up at first. "You're late," she said. Again. Edmund closed the door gently behind him. The click sounded louder than it should have. Work had been long. The road had been quiet. The city tense. Opportunity shrinking. He felt something unfamiliar pressing against his chest, not urgency, but compression. Like a room with too little air. His mother finally looked at him and smiled without warmth. "There he is," she said. "Big Ed. Still playing chauffeur to lunatics." He set his keys down carefully. "They prefer the term patience," he replied. She laughed. A short, sharp sound. "Of course you'd defend them." The conversation followed its usual path. She criticized his job. His posture. His inability to find a woman. She reminded him, again, that he scared people. That his size was an excuse waiting to happen. That he was, in her words, a walking warning sign. Edmund listened. He always had. Each sentence landed with practiced accuracy. She knew where to press. She always had. Years of repetition had refined her aim. This was not anger. This was maintenance. "You know," she said, sipping her drink, "if you just had a normal childhood, maybe you wouldn't be so strange." The irony hovered between them, unnoticed by her. Edmund looked around the room. The clean counters. The family photographs. Smiling faces frozen in moments that never lasted. Something in him aligned. Not snapped. Aligned. He spoke quietly. "You locked me in the basement," he said. "You told my sisters I was dangerous." She waved a hand dismissively. "You were dangerous." The word landed softly. Final. Comfortable. That was when Edmund understood there would never be an ending to this conversation. No apology waiting at the finish line. No recognition. No release. Mother's Day, he realized, never ends. It just repeats. What happened next was not loud. There was no argument. No raised voices. No dramatic struggle. Just a conclusion reached after years of rehearsal. Later, he would describe it clinically. Detached. Almost instructional. Investigators would note how clearly he recalled the sequence, as if narrating someone else's life. Afterward, the house felt emptier. Not peaceful, finished. Edmund moved through the rooms methodically. Cleaned. Organized. Corrected small details that had always bothered him. The radio still played. The cheerful voice announced another song. The contrast was almost funny. He laughed once. Quietly. Not because it was amusing, but because it was absurd that it had taken this long. When it was over, when there was nothing left to say or undo, Edmund sat down at the kitchen table. The same chair she had used. The same view of the room. For the first time, the voice was gone. No criticism. No correction. No running commentary on his existence. Just silence. And in that silence, something unexpected happened. There was no triumph. No relief. Only a hollow clarity. The pressure that had driven everything else began to collapse inward. The road. The girls. The routines. They suddenly felt unnecessary. Distractions from a conversation that was now, finally, complete. Edmund stood and went to the phone. The number was familiar. He had rehearsed this part too, though he hadn't known when he would need it. When the line connected, he spoke calmly. "I think I need to turn myself in," he said. The circle closed neatly. Mother's Day had ended. And with it, the story everyone thought they were investigating changed its shape entirely. Because the crimes on the road had been symptoms. This had always been the disease. The aftermath was quieter than anyone expected. The city still hummed with life, indifferent to what had happened behind a closed door. Headlines faded. Conversations moved on. Even the police, the ones who had chased patterns and speculated endlessly, eventually filed the case under history, a grim chapter, closed but not fully understood. Edmund Kemper returned to the routines he had mastered. Work. Quiet apartments. Coffee and newspapers. He moved through the world with the same calm precision that had carried him before. Nothing seemed to notice him. Nothing demanded more than compliance. He did not celebrate. He did not mourn. He did not feel relief. Only a strange emptiness lingered, like the silence after a storm that never announced itself. Evidence was catalogued. Testimonies recorded. Investigators pieced together timelines, noting patterns, matching behaviors, confirming suspicions. Yet, even as the puzzle formed, the men who had caused it all remained unnervingly composed. He answered questions politely, clarified details when asked, corrected small inaccuracies. His voice was calm, measured, almost courteous. In the streets, people walked freely. Children went to school. The world continued without acknowledging that it had been dancing along the edge of something incomprehensible. For Edmund, there was no relief in the continuation of life. Only reflection. The knowledge that everything he had done, every choice, every calculation, had irrevocably shaped the world around him. And yet the world remained blind to his presence. He sat in his apartment one evening, looking at the newspapers stacked in neat piles. Articles about the murders were printed, then archived, then forgotten. He traced names and dates with his finger, careful and deliberate. Patterns, he thought, are only frightening when someone else notices them. He considered the girls who had trusted him, the officers who had shared confidences, the people who had underestimated him because of appearances. He did not feel guilt. Not yet. Perhaps never. He felt understanding. Clarity. A grim satisfaction that the lessons of patience, observation, and timing had been applied perfectly. Yet something stirred uneasily within him. A shadow of boredom. A whisper that the game had ended, and the real experiment, observing consequences, witnessing the aftermath, was beginning. The house was silent. Outside, traffic murmured in the night. Somewhere, distant sirens pierced the darkness, oblivious to the events that had passed. Edmund lit a cigarette. The smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling, a spiral of patience and waiting. For the first time, he allowed himself to wonder, what comes next when nothing is left to do? When the chaos he orchestrated has concluded, and only the record remains. No answer arrived. Only the hollow quiet. And in that quiet, he realized the truth: history remembers facts, not the weight behind them. The road, the girls, the patterns, the fear, all were gone, reduced to memories filed away in minds that would soon forget. Except for him. Edmund Kemper remained. Silent. Observing. Waiting. The first line had been crossed years ago. Now, the rest was just reflection. And sometimes, reflection is heavier than action. The phone rang again. Not at midnight this time, but early morning, when the city was still waking and the air carried both dew and dust. The sound cut sharply through the quiet apartment, pulling Edmund from his careful reflection. He answered with the same calm, measured tone he had used all his life. Yes. The voice on the other end was different now. It belonged to someone waiting for a story, hungry for closure, unaware that they were speaking to the source. Edmund began. He did not scream. He did not apologize. He did not justify. He spoke as one would give a lecture. Every detail precise, every action deliberate, every motive distilled to cold clarity. Dates, locations, the order of events, all delivered without embellishment, without hesitation. The voice was calm, almost inviting. Yet beneath it lay the weight of decades, patience honed into exactness, cruelty masked by civility. He described the road. The girls who trusted him. The officers who joked, unknowingly supplying him with insight. The methodical way he observed and learned. His mother. The farmhouse. The basement. Every moment connected, every choice deliberate. There was humor too. Dry. Ironic. Dark as night. He laughed softly at the absurdities he had lived, how the world assumed the loudest were the most dangerous, how authority adored compliance, how life had mistaken patience for harmlessness. His irony was subtle, a quiet razor edge beneath the calm narrative. The listener, the officer, the journalist, whoever it was, took notes feverishly, occasionally interjecting, asking questions, seeking confirmation. Edmund answered politely, correcting errors gently, repeating sequences when necessary. Every correction, every clarification, added weight to the confession. "You feel bad?" came the inevitable question. Edmund paused. Just long enough to remind the asker that timing, even in conversation, could be intimidating. "I feel bad," he said finally, "that it took so long for anyone to notice." The line was silent. Because truth is louder than outrage, and far heavier. Hours passed. Details spilled out. Names, behaviors, evidence, all presented in a performance both clinical and theatrical. The confession itself became a stage. Edmund was the conductor, the audience unsure whether to be horrified or impressed by the precision, the patience, the chilling calm. When he finally hung up, he did not lean back or sigh. No relief passed over him. He returned to the chair, the cigarette still smoldering in the ashtray, the sunlight now fully warming the room. The act was complete. The truth laid bare. And yet, as he stared at the walls around him, the realization settled cold and unyielding: nobody would truly understand it. The confession, meticulously performed, had delivered clarity. But clarity is only terrifying when it lands in minds capable of bearing it. Most would forget. Most would move on. The horror, precise and detailed, would soon be reduced to summary lines, police reports, and faded newspaper clippings. Edmund Kemper remained. Polite. Calm. Observant. And the echo of his voice lingered, heavier than any scream. Time passed differently for Edmund Kemper after the confession. The streets moved on. Headlines faded. The public sphere became nostalgia, a distant shiver in the collective memory. Newspapers printed summaries. Documentaries recounted facts. Psychologists debated motives. And yet the man himself remained, silent and unchanged, a presence that carried the weight of actions no one fully grasped. He walked through the world as he always had, tall, quiet, polite. A giant in appearance, invisible in intention. People trusted him easily. They overlooked him. They assumed his compliance meant harmlessness. They assumed normalcy where there was none. But inside, he observed. Calculated. Reflected. He carried every memory, every detail, every lesson. Not for repetition. Not for thrill. Only as evidence of the strange calculus of life and human nature. He pondered morality often. Not abstractly, but practically. The way rules bend under expectation. The way people ignore subtle threats. The way patience becomes a tool of survival, and, sometimes, of control. He did not romanticize his crimes. He catalogued them. Studied them. Accepted their consequences. Sometimes, when alone, he would think of the girls on the road. Not with anger. Not with excitement. Only with recognition that trust is a currency easily spent, and even the smallest gestures of civility can be fatal in the wrong hands. He would think of his mother. And understand that some conflicts cannot be solved by explanation or apology. Some voices demand closure only when action replaces words. And yet he remained calm. Observing the world that continued to misunderstand him. People moved past horror quickly, comforted by distance. He existed in a space between memory and history, present yet untouchable. Every time someone mentioned his name, there was a whisper of fascination. But fascination is fleeting. Memory fades. And truth, the kind that lingers in the bones, is often buried beneath convenience. Edmund Kemper learned that the most lasting effect of his life was not terror, not violence, not notoriety. It was the knowledge that patience, observation, and understanding human nature could surpass the world's assumptions. That being seen as harmless is a power few recognize. Sometimes, he would walk past a girl hitchhiking, or hear a siren wail in the distance. He would smile faintly, not cruelly, but knowingly. The world assumed it was coincidence. It was not. And yet, there was no triumph in this realization. No satisfaction. Only reflection. Only the quiet understanding that actions have consequences, even when the world chooses to forget them. Edmund Kemper remained. And sometimes, late at night, when the city is silent except for the hum of distant traffic, the echo of a voice lingers in memory. A voice calm, polite, precise. A voice that reminds us that monsters do not always roar. Sometimes, they simply wait. And sometimes, the most terrifying truth is that the world keeps walking as if nothing ever happened. Because history remembers facts, not the weight behind them. And sometimes, truth disappears with those who knew it.